Good evening. If you would like, you can go ahead and open your Bibles up to Matthew chapter 12. That's where we'll begin tonight, Matthew chapter 12. Jesus went down into Jerusalem for a feast, and while he was there was some confrontations about the Sabbath, and so we kind of grouped several of Jesus's conflicts with the scribes and the Pharisees over the Sabbath issue together. And last time we ended with the discussion in the synagogue, where there was a man with a withered hand, and they watched him as whether or not he would heal them, so they might have something to accuse him. So how did Jesus dodge their trap here? He didn't dodge their trap. He said, hey, come here, come forward. And then he said, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? And nobody would answer because they all wanted to trap him. He was angry at their hardness of their heart. And so he said, it is lawful to do good. Any of you, if you had a sheep fall into the ditch or into a pit on the Sabbath, you'd lift it out. You wouldn't have a problem with that. And here's a human being. And he said, stretch out your hand. And the man stretched it out and it was whole. And everybody would be amazed at that. But what did they go out and do? Plot to kill him. They went out to plot to kill him. So rather than being impressed with the fact that God is working through this man, our concept of what can be done on the Sabbath must be different than God's concept. We need to change our thinking. Instead, they said, this man's got to die because he differs with us on this. And so they're attempting to kill him. So in Matthew chapter 12, we pick up in Matthew's account here, right after that, you look at verse 14, the Pharisees went out and took counsel against him, how they might destroy him. And then verse 15, it says, but when Jesus knew it, he withdrew from there, and a great multitude followed him, and he healed them, and he warned them not to make him known. Now, I want to notice two things here. They're plotting to kill him, so they've intensified the conflict here. What does Jesus do? He withdraws. All right, that's point number one. He withdraws. Secondly, verse 15, he heals a great multitude. And then thirdly, look at verse 16, he warned them not to make him known. And Matthew says, now he did these three things to fulfill the prophecy that Isaiah prophesied about him. And I want to read this prophecy and just look at these ideas in here. Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoking flax he will not quench, till he sends forth justice to victory, and in his name Gentiles will trust. Okay, now this whole conflict over the Sabbath was great opportunity for people to come to understand that Jesus is the promised one of God. Why could they come to that conclusion from these discussions? Because of his miracles, because he had the power to heal. The Spirit was working through him and healing. And so you notice that in this prophecy of Isaiah, behold, my servant whom I have chosen, this is God speaking about Jesus, about the Christ, the Messiah, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. That's what the Jews should have understood about Jesus. I will put my Spirit upon him, and he will declare justice to any evidence that God has put his Spirit upon Jesus? Absolutely, lots of it. So he will declare justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. Rather than when they seek to destroy him, he doesn't send fire down from heaven. He doesn't strike them with blindness. What he does is he withdraws from them. And when people want to magnify him or declare his name, what does he do? He warns them not to make him known. And so this idea of he will not quarrel nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoking flax he will not quench. We see the tenderness, non-confrontational at this point on that. It's not that he's non-confrontational about truth, but he's not looking for a fight. He's not looking to publicize himself at this point. We see the purpose of his ministry was to do the work of his Father, to declare justice to the Gentiles. He will send forth justice to victory, and in his name, the Gentiles will trust. What are the Jewish leadership doing right now? Are they trusting in him? No, they're rejecting him. So this is the fulfillment of the prophet Isaiah. The way that Jesus will carry out his ministry turns off the Jewish leadership, but draws unbelievers or Gentiles to him. And so we'll see that progress. So I just wanted to give a little explanation there of why what Jesus was doing with these conflicts with the Pharisees and the scribes, why that was a fulfillment of what God had prophesied about his ministry. Anybody have anything you want to add about that? We've got to tie up a few loose ends from the last class that we didn't get to. You got anything you want to add about that?
No, sir. Well said.
All right, let's jump over, if you will, to Luke chapter 6. And we'll cover something there in Luke chapter 6. At some point, when Jesus withdrew from the conflicts in Jerusalem, he goes back up to Galilee. I don't think we're told about this travel back up to Galilee, but he's back in Capernaum, or at least back by the Sea of Galilee. When we see in verse 12, it came to pass in those days that he went out on the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer. So here's one of the many times that we see Jesus departing and going out to pray. This time, how long does he pray? All night long, all night long. And I don't think that Jesus prayed all night long, like a lot, like every week or whatever. I don't know. But the reason I think it states at this time is because he has a really important decision that he's going to be making on this next day. And so he spends the whole night petitioning the Father. Here's what he does the next day. When it was day, he called his disciples to him, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. Now, we've already met some of the disciples. Some of the disciples have already left their businesses, left their families to follow Jesus around, but they haven't been made apostles yet. What's the difference between an apostle and a disciple?
So a disciple, it means kind of a follower. An apostle is a messenger. It could also mean one sent on a mission. So you see a change in role there. You've got just a mere follower, but now one who's appointed for a specific task, and it's going to be in the Lord's kingdom.
Hold your place there and flip over to Mark chapter 3 real fast. I just want to point out why he chose these 12 and talking about that, why he named them apostles or those who are going to be specially sent on a task. Verse 14 of Mark chapter 3 says this, he appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have power and to heal sickness and to cast out demons. Okay, so you see the difference between all the other disciples and these 12. He chose them that he might send them out to preach and to have these demonstrations of power. But these 12 are very, very important. And you know why. Because it's going to rest upon these 12. Really, the rest of Jesus' ministry is going to be spent with these 12. One of them is going to contribute to him being put to death. The other 11 are going to go out and be the foundation of his teaching to the world. The rest of the New Testament depends a lot upon these men. Many of their writings are what constitute the rest of the New Testament. Very, very important decision in choosing these. Spends all night in prayer. And so he names them, verse 14, back in Luke chapter 6, Simon, whom he also named Peter, Andrew, his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Simon, called the Zealot, Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And so we have just a little bit along the way. How many of those can you identify that we've already met? Matthew, called him from the tax booth. James and John. Peter. Andrew. Yeah, those we have specifically met already. And so we already know some background, kind of know them already.
We've met Philip.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And
very good.
A lot of people consider Nathaniel Bartholomew the same person. So if they are, we've met him as well.
Very good.
But in a lot of ways, these are kind of some seemingly ordinary men. We're talking about a fisherman, tax collector. We get an idea that James and John were fishermen too. We know one has some political fervor. He's a zealot. But these are going to be men that go on to be of the most important in all of history because of, like Lonnie was saying, the authority that is entrusted to them by Jesus. So we're very familiar with this section of the text. But jumping ahead, Matthew 28, Jesus came up and spoke to them, the 12, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to keep all that I commanded you. And behold, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. So that's the authority Jesus is going to entrust to them. And that makes them some very important figures in the text and in human history.
Yeah. So for the next 2.5 years of Jesus' life, it's really going to be centered on teaching them. We'll see them him often withdrawing with these 12 to prepare them for the task that he has entrusted for them in the future.
I said the 12. I guess in Matthew 28 it would be the 11 at that point. So.
Yeah. So, any thoughts, comments before we move forward?
Well, he seen a lot in them because when he asked him, he left everything and followed him.
They did. Yeah, that's right. Yes, very good. All right, so there's a little transition here in Luke chapter 6, verse 17. He came down with them, so he was up on a mountain, continuing all night and pray, and then he called and chose these 12. And then verse 17, he came down with them and stood on a level place with the crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, as well as those who were tormented with unclean spirits, and they were all healed. And the whole multitude sought to touch him, and power went out from him, and he healed them. Now, then you notice in verse 20, he lifted up his eyes towards the disciples and said, "Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom." And he begins the Beatitudes. So we have the Sermon on the Mount is what happens. He was up on the mount praying all night. He chose the 12. He came down a little bit on the mount to a level place where people could gather to him. A large crowd gathers to him. He's healing them and he's teaching them. And it's on this occasion that we have probably the most complete sermon that we have of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount. And for that, we'll flip over to Matthew chapter 5 and we'll pick up there. So Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, we're going to spend the next 3 classes looking at because it's profound teaching and the most complete record that we have of Jesus's of one of Jesus's sermons, and I don't know that we have the whole sermon here, but we have more information here than anywhere else of what maybe one of Jesus's typical teaching, one of his typical sermons might look like. Any thoughts before we begin? You got anything else you want to add?
We're all pretty familiar with a lot of these, maybe some of us, and hopefully there's new applications to be made, and we can always refresh on these things. But as we read, I think it is interesting to consider this from a first century mindset, to think about maybe what they had in mind already and the teaching that it's going to be thrown their way. It might be shocking and very different to hear, and maybe not necessarily what they would have expected from the figure that they are calling the Messiah. Maybe these teachings are much different than they thought would happen. So.
Paul Earnhardt has a book in which he talks about how radical this sermon is. It's about the kingdom of God and its expectation. God's expectation of the kingdom was totally different than man's expectation of the kingdom. And as you look at this, thinking about what God is calling you to in his kingdom is, well, it's humbling. It's very humbling as you look at this. So we'll get into it. All right, chapter 5, verse 1, seeing the multitude, he went up on the mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when you are reviled, when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Before we get into that, I meant to show you something else. The location, the traditional location for the Sermon on the Mount is this mountain or hill right on the side of the Sea of Galilee there. We don't know that that's exactly where it took place, but it was somewhere in the proximity. This gives you an idea of what the scenery, what the terrain would look like where Jesus was teaching. And as he's talking to them here, you notice he starts off blessed. What does it mean to be blessed? Happy. That's what it means. Happy are the ones who are poor in spirit, who mourn, who are meek, who are hungry and thirsty, who are pure in heart, who are peacemakers, who are persecuted. Is that the kind of happiness you were looking for? Do you see how immediately it starts off with, whoa, are you sure? Are you sure? And Jesus is like, yes, that is true happiness and joy. Poor in spirit. What do you think that means? Humble. Can you think of a time in David's life when he was poor in spirit? Yes. Think of Psalm 51 where he's begging the Lord for forgiveness for his sin with Bathsheba. And did he find happiness in that? Yes, by returning to the Lord and finding favor. The bones that you have crushed, that they may be healed. Restore your spirit to me. And God did. But he wouldn't have if he wasn't poor in spirit. So happy are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. They shall be comforted. Again, I think we could see that in David.
Can I answer an example right here?
Absolutely.
Thinking about poor in spirit, those who mourn. It really reminds me of the woman in Luke 7, the woman in Nain. And so, and behold, there was a woman in the city who was a sinner. And when she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought perfume. Verse 38, and standing behind him at his feet, crying, she began to wet his feet with her tears. And she kept wiping them with the hair of her head and kissing his feet and anointing them with the perfume. This, to me, is a great example of someone who is poor in spirit, who's mourning, who's recognizing her condition and seeing these things and acknowledging it. And then, like the text says, there's going to be reward for her because of her acknowledgement here that Jesus promises that as the result. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, perfect. Anytime. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Those are the happy ones, not the ones who are content, not the ones who are satisfied with, I'm fine the way that I am. But those who have a craving, a gnawing desire to grow spiritually, to learn more, to know, to understand, they shall be filled. The merciful, they're the ones that are going to obtain mercy. The pure in heart, the utterly sincere, I think is the way one translation words that. They're single-minded. They will see God. In other words, that's their burning desire. They seek first the kingdom of God, and they shall see God. The peacemakers, they shall be called the sons of God. Those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then he concludes by saying, when that happens to you, rejoice, because you're going to have your reward. You're going to have your reward. You will find the happiness that you're looking for. But you look at those characteristics, and when you're thinking about a kingdom and a people who are reigning, you don't think about poor in spirit, mourning, meek, hungering, thirsting, merciful, peacemakers, persecuted. That's not what comes to mind. And Jesus says, but that's how you're going to get. That's how you're going to get to be what you need to be. That's what being in the kingdom is going to consist of, and that is where you will find happiness. That is where you will find happiness. Wow. Can you accept that? Can you understand why there were many who were like, I don't think that's for me, and walked away? Any thoughts, comments through the first 12 verses? That's right. Yes, it is. We've got to be different. Very good point. Inherit the earth. I don't know. That phrase is used a lot throughout the Old Testament. And you may have a footnote there rather than earth, the land. You don't have one? Oh, okay. I think that word can mean earth or it can mean land. But I think this idea of inheritance traces all the way back. You think about how prominent it is through Abraham and all that. I don't know. I don't know how literal Jesus is being here. If it's saying that ultimately we're going to dwell on the earth and reign over the earth and paradise is going to be on earth again. I know that there are those that hold that view. I'm not sure the scripture teaches that. That doesn't fit as well with the rest of the scripture to me. I tend to take this more as saying this goes back to the type of language. The ones who are going to inherit, the ones who are going to obtain are going to be the ones who are meek in that. So I don't know how literal to take that phrase there. They'll receive a blessing. That's right. Very good. Good way of saying it.
I like the idea here of mentioning hunger and thirst. So the idea there is you're supposed to desire righteousness. Well, to what extent? And I like that he gives that physical example that everybody, maybe in different levels, can relate to. Because when you're hungry and you're thirsty, there's recognition in your body that something is lacking, and you desire it, and you're going to seek it out. And it's the same thing here for righteousness, that blessed are those who are going to behave that same way towards righteousness. We're going to mention anything else about persecution?
I was not. Go ahead.
Okay, so about the persecution, that's interesting because this is the exact opposite of what you think a kingdom should look like. And I think maybe sometimes skeptics or people just with questions might say, well, why would God design a kingdom like that? But I think maybe that's a short-sighted view because Ecclesiastes and the book of James maybe says things like this. Our life is a vapor. It's just a moment in time, and we're looking towards eternity. And what's eternity look like for these people who are having these attitudes and are undergoing this persecution? Great is your reward in heaven. That's the goal. That's what we're looking for. So we can face persecution, we can face tribulation, and we can even rejoice in that because we can look forward to the reward and know that's ahead of us. And so I think that's a strong encouragement in the face of dark moments to have that goal in mind.
Any other thoughts in that section? Yeah. Right. Yes. Yeah. And your priorities are in a different place. You know, a lot of people, the reason they're so bothered by that is because it is men that they're trying to please. And men are against them now, and that really bothers them. But if it's God that you're really trying to please and men are against you, that's okay, because I know I'm pleasing the one that I really care about pleasing. Yeah, very good point.
I like the fact that it says that those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be filled.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that you're not going to be satisfied with what you thought.
Yes, great.
Good point.
Yeah, very good.
Point. I think it's interesting too, verses 9 and 10. Blessed are the peacemakers. So as Christians, how do we try to make peace? What are some ways?
Just don't bring up things that might be.
Yeah, I think through our interactions with people, we want peace too. We also we want to have peace with God, right? We want to have peace with God. So peace in our interactions, peace with God. And so it's interesting though, verse 10 talks about persecution. Not everybody's going to accept that peace with God that we try to have in the world. They're going to look at it and maybe they're spiteful about it or rejecting it, but not everybody's going to accept it. So, but like you were saying, we can have that peace and we can keep that and look forward to things to come.
That's right. As much as depends upon us, we try to live peaceably with all men. Very good. All right, verse 13. And you are salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Larson had some things to say about this passage recently. And as he's talking to his disciples, as he's talking to those who are going to follow him, he makes the point that you are going to have an influence on the world. You are going to be distinct, you are going to be different, and you are going to stand out. And that's the way it should be. How many of you would put salt on your food if it had no taste, if it just like tasted like beach sand? No. The reason you put it on there is because it has a distinct flavor and it brings out something. And you want to, if it didn't do that, then it wouldn't be much value. Light in darkness has incredible value. And so the point that he's making is that distinctiveness, all of those traits that we just looked at are going to make you different in the world, as Dwight was just talking about. Don't be ashamed of that. Don't try to hide that. Recognize that, yes, you will have a different flavor than the rest of the world. You will stand out and shine in the world. You don't put that underneath a basket. You let that shine. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. It draws attention to him. That's who's the King. That's who we're trying to honor and glorify. you have anything on that section?
Well said.
Anybody else? All right.
I do think, real quick, I do think the Beatitudes maybe seem to reflect somebody who is shining their light. So you have, they're merciful, pure in heart, meek. There's somebody who desires righteousness. So I think there's kind of a correlation here. If you have these attributes, you're probably going to be somebody who's shining their light, who's going to be the salt of the earth. And so I think it's a good exercise for us to look across those Beatitudes and say to ourselves, are we living up to this? Do we match this standard? And it can be a good measuring stick for us as well. And I do want to bring up, I know Larson mentioned this really recently, but I like the idea, he said a city on the hill. And so there's kind of a collectiveness within that it's not just, it's individually, of course, but it's also a collective thing too, as bodies of Christians.
All right, verse 17. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but what? That's important. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. All right, strong words here. First of all, let's talk about how does Jesus regard the law? He wants people to do what the law says. Does he have a high regard for the law? Absolutely. He gives this expression, not one jot or tittle. And I think this is helpful for us to think about because here's the Hebrew alphabet. A jot or a tittle, we've got this over here in our alphabet so you can kind of get an idea. A J is not one of our larger letters. And the dot of I is certainly one of the small marks. What you have with the jot is the smallest Hebrew letter. The Hebrew letter that has the smallest mark. I think it's called a yod. It's that's the name of that letter is yod. And then a tittle is just the little mark. What do we call that in English? Is a serif? Is that what a serif is on when you write something and you have like a little wing off of? Is that right? Thank you.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, all right. You're going to have to nod bigger than that. I'm looking over here. All right, a serif, yes. And so all that he's saying is, you want to talk about how serious Jesus was about the law. He said, let me tell you, there's not one little stroke of the law that's not going to be fulfilled, that's not going to come to pass. And so what I'm about to say and what I'm teaching and what I'm practicing is not something contrary to the law. It's not something that the law didn't have in view. I came to explain to you what was in view, every little minute detail of it. Now, how was Jesus going to fulfill the law ultimately? He died on the cross. The law talked about that there would be a Messiah that was coming that would be able to offer salvation for those who would follow him and believe in him, that his blood would be shed so that he would bear our burdens and we would find forgiveness in him. Ultimately, that's what the law was pointing to. Ultimately, Jesus was going to be the fulfillment of that. But what Jesus is teaching right now is, the law also had the purpose of bringing people to be what God wanted them to be righteous, to have the character that God wanted them to have. And the scribes and the Pharisees weren't getting that done. Now, I want you to think about, you mentioned this, what it would be like to hear Jesus teach this as a Jew living in the first century. Who are the people who really have the law figured out, who know all of the details of it, know all the things, follow it, super strict about it, just the ultra righteous? Who are they? And then Jesus says, unless you're more righteous than them, you're not going to make it. We talked about some of their laws about the Sabbath that were just overwhelming. What would be your immediate reaction hearing Jesus say, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven? What would you think?
Might as well go home now
Yeah, it's hopeless. It's hopeless. I can't even keep up with all of the things that they do and say anyway. There's no way that I'm gonna. And what Jesus is about to show though is, no, they're missing it. They're missing it. And he's about to go through and describe some of those things, give examples of those things. But any thoughts, comments up through verse 20?
This is right after he says too, but whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom. I
That's
think
right.
that would be the general population's viewpoint of the religious leaders, is they do the law and they teach the law.
Yeah.
And then he drops that bombshell statement. So, you would be taken back by it, like you said.
It sounds like, he's saying his message really shouldn't come off right.
Yeah,
Because, if they had internalized the law, all this was that.
that's right. Yes, that's right. Very good point. Very good point. But that's not what's happening in first century Judaism. They're not internalizing the law. And so Jesus is going to talk about this. So let's pick up in verse 21. He's going to give a series of these. You have heard, but I say to you. Now, some people have the idea that, what Jesus was doing is the law said this, and now Jesus is saying, now here's the new covenant. I don't think that's what's taking place here. I think what Jesus is doing is, you've heard this teaching about the law, but let me tell you what God intended the law to do. All right, so look at verse 21. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. All right, where did they ever get that idea? The law said that. You shall not murder. And whoever murders will be in danger of judgment. And the law said that as well. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raka, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. You ever thought about murdering anybody? Why did your wife just poke you in the side? I saw that. I couldn't help but point that out. Those of you who may have at one time contemplated murdering somebody, why did that thought come into your mind? Because you were angry. Contempt was there. Hatred built up in you somehow. Murder would never be a problem if we didn't have those feelings. You don't just walk down the street and just randomly see somebody and say, I'd like to kill them. No, there's something there. There's some anger that's already there. They've done something, or you've let it build up in you in some way. And so Jesus says, let me tell you, when the law said do not murder, what was implied in that is you don't allow that contempt to build up in you. Don't let the root of murder start in your heart. And so he gives a couple of examples here. Whoever says to his brother, Raka. Does anybody have a footnote or a different, maybe a different version that? All right, stupid. Yes, that's exactly right. Stupid. All right, and then whoever says you fool. Does anybody have anything there? Or worthless person. All right, you idiot. You ever heard somebody say that? All right. Now sometimes Amanda and I joke back and forth, and we will say things back in. I'm sorry. I got you in trouble. Now I'm getting myself in trouble. And, but we will jokingly say, "Oh, that was so stupid. That was so stupid." All right, is that contempt? All right, we can say those things lighthearted, without animosity, without contempt in our heart. But you know the difference between saying, "That's so stupid," and saying, "You're stupid." You see the difference? Now, I don't see you. I'm devaluing you. I'm devaluing you in my heart. How you end up killing a person murdering a person, is you devalue them to the point that you don't think they're worth living. That's what happens. And they are God's creation. So when you say things like stupid or idiot or things like that, you're devaluing that person. And so when you're thinking those words and it's with that contempt in your heart, boy, you need to check yourself real quick and say, okay, you know what the law would say about that? The law would say about that, you shall not commit murder. And really, that's what's happening in me. I'm developing that mentality in me. Make sense? You got anything you want to add to that?
He's bringing out the principle that was behind the law all along.
That's right.
you care if I make a comment real quick?
Go
on
for it.
Verses 23, 24.
Mhm.
So the idea there, if you have something against your brother and you're going to give a gift to the altar, well, set down your gift. First, go to your brother, be reconciled to him. It's kind of what those verses say. I've heard Larson make this point. I really like it before, so I want to share it. So here you have somebody, their brother has something against you. Okay, your brother has something against you. So what do? You go to him to be reconciled. If you go to Matthew 18, verse 15, now if your brother sins, go and show him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. So you've got one person with somebody's holding something against them, and one person who this person has a thing against them, and then someone's like they're meeting in the middle. They're meeting in the middle. So I love that image of if you've done somebody wrong, go to them, and if somebody's done you wrong, go to them to talk to them about it. And if both of those people have that attitude, they meet in the middle, and you have peace and harmony, and everything works out. And I love that image that Jesus tells both sides of a situation like that what to do in the face of it.
Would you just read verse 23 through 26 for us so we can get that whole context there?
Absolutely. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into the prison. Assuredly, I say to you, you will by no means get out of there until you have paid the last penny.
When is the best time to resolve a conflict with someone? As soon as possible. As soon as possible. And this is true when we're talking about murder. Murder usually takes place when conflicts were not resolved as soon as possible. It builds and it festers into the point where there's this deep hatred that's there that leads to murder. All right, but there's something else. If you wait too long, it will cost you everything. It will cost you everything. So here's the illustration that somebody has a problem with you and you have a problem with them or whatever, and you don't take care of it right away, and what ends up happening is it gets taken to legal court, and then you've got all of these expenses, and you end up being found guilty, and boy, all this compounds. It could have been taken care of by just simply working it out to begin with. Neighbor's property had a dispute of 3 foot on the property line. By the way, this is not like they have a tiny yard and, it's really important. I mean, they've got like 80 acres. Both parties had like 80 acres. And they're disputing over 3 foot on a property line. And they went into a court battle that lasted several years and cost like $50,000 to the person who lost. And it's just like, was that worth it? Was that worth it for that? Couldn't you just said, hey, let's just split the difference, or you can have it, or whatever. We're not going to fight about it. Ridiculous. Okay. Now, when is the best time to resolve a conflict with God? As soon as possible. And I really think that what's underlying, maybe an underlying idea here, is not only can you understand that principle with people, with God, you better understand that principle. Because assuredly I say to you, you will by no means get out of there until you've paid the last penny. If you wait too long in resolving your conflict with God, it will cost you everything. Any thoughts through verse 26? All right, here's another one. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. Where's that found? Yeah, the law. But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Do you think that anybody ever ends up committing adultery without first lusting after that person? I don't think so. That's where it begins. And so how do you get to adultery? Well, you get to adultery through lust. So I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery in his heart. That's already begun. So what do you need to do? You make every effort to make sure that you don't allow that seed to get in your heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Anybody have a footnote there on the word hell? What? Yeah, Gehenna. Gehenna is the word. Does anybody know what the word Gehenna means? the Valley of Hinnom, the Valley of the Son of Hinnom in the Old Testament. If we were to look at a map of Jerusalem, you have on the southwest side, southwest side, you have the Valley of the Son of Hinnom that runs right down there. Anybody remember anything that's happened there significant in the Old Testament? That's right. Ahaz and let's see who else. Manasseh had that set up. That's where the children were sacrificed to all of the pagan gods. And so you have some good kings like Hezekiah and Josiah that go, and what they turn that into is the city garbage dump, defiling it so that it would never again be used for pagan practices. So the history of it is terrible, terrible abominations took place here where idols were worshipped and humans were sacrificed to these idols. And now what it looked like in Jesus' day is not only was that a terrible, that place had a terrible history, now it's a terrible place to go. Because if you were to go there, by the way, here's a picture of the Valley of Hinnom today on the southwest side of Jerusalem. And the picture that when he would say, then that your whole body should go to the Valley of Hinnom, this is the picture that people would have in their mind when Jesus said that. A place where the fire never goes out because there's always garbage being dumped. The animal carcasses that are there are putrefying, rotting. The maggot never stops wiggling around there because there's always fresh carcasses there. Disgusting, abominable, defiled, corrupt place. Root lust out of your life so that you don't spend eternity there. That's the point. That's the point. I think it's helpful to appreciate when Jesus talks about Gehenna, when we use the word hell, to have a picture of what they were seeing in that. It wasn't just a place of fire with a little guy in a red suit with a pitchfork. It was a place of utter corruption. Utter corruption. Thoughts, comments?
Well said.
Anybody? You want to take verse 31?
Sure. So he continues this idea of highlighting the principles behind the law that's been there all along. So verse 31, furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason, except for sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. So from my understanding about this, the permit of divorce in the Old Testament was almost like an allowance, because in that time there was maybe to give them allowance during this time, looking forward to what was to come, and maybe have more to say about that, Lonnie. But to me, Jesus provides spiritual grounds for divorce in this moment and highlights maybe God's intention for it all along, that it wasn't necessarily something he wanted to be happening here, that there is this spiritual grounds for divorce, but overall this is not something he wanted to be happening.
Yeah, so it's that same concept. They took something that was said in Deuteronomy 24 and began a teaching about that. It was like, okay, you can get a divorce, just make sure you give a certificate of divorce. And Jesus is saying, but I'm telling you, that's not what God ever wanted. That's not what God's intention was. Even in that provision, that was not what God's intention was, that divorce is okay, just give a certificate of divorce. Any thoughts through that? We will come across this again later in the Gospel of Matthew and then also in the other accounts as well. But anything you would like to say about this now?
You know, it's interesting to me that it's sexual immorality is the only loophole as far as excusing divorce. You know, it doesn't say emotional abuse or even physical abuse. It says sexual immorality.
Yes.
And, of course, it's, we see a world where people use excuses all the time for divorce and everything, but this is just the one.
Yeah. Yep. And in some of the other accounts, he doesn't even mention the exception. I don't think that invalidates the exception. I'm just making the point that Jesus didn't have a very broad view of oh yeah, it's okay, and so pretty narrow scope there.
In our minds, too, we would think that abuse would be a good reason for
Sure.
divorce. But that's not what he says.
Yeah. And if you're in an unhappy marriage, there are a lot of good reasons that you have in your mind for it. But you're right. I mean, there are some that probably all of us could agree that, well, I think that would be a good reason. But you're right. The exception that is given, and it's given more than once without any additions to it. So that's what we have. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's right. All right, we're out of time. I want you to, I would love to get through this whole section to keep that flow of thought, because now we're about to get into some more that were actually abuses of the law, more than statements of the law. But Jesus gets to the principle of what God wants as well. So we'll kind of go back and review that flow of thought. Your righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. You've heard what the scribes and the Pharisees said, but I'm telling you what the real concept of the law was. And we'll look at that next time. Thank you for your good attention. Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.